Hello, my name is Glenn Vickery and welcome to my YouTube channel, Kiwi Bushcraft and Survival. And today we're going to go into the second part of the self-defense series. So firstly I'd like to start with today with self-defense in general. Some people don't know when they are legally allowed to defend themselves, and they don't know to what extent they can defend themselves. So it can be quite unclear for some people, and hence they don't want to defend themselves in case they get themselves into trouble. So we're going to be covering some of that today. So the first thing is the law. Okay, we'll start with the law. Now I can't speak for other countries, however for New Zealand, or mainly any countries that are part of the British Empire, it'll come under these laws, and most countries around the world are quite similar. So, in New Zealand, we have what is called the Crimes Act 1961. Section 48 of the Crimes Act 1961 gives us our guidance as to what, where, when, who, and how we can defend ourselves and others against assault. Okay, so the Crimes Act will sort of give us an idea of where we stand, and from there we'll go through some scenarios as we go through the entire series, and you'll be able to pick up everything from scratch in self-defense right through to the maximum level. Okay, legislation in New Zealand. So Section 48 of the Crimes Act 1961, what is it? It provides justification, which means a person is not guilty of an offence and not liable to any civil proceeding for using self-defence in some circumstances to protect themselves and others. So what that's saying is that if you are justified in using self-defence, you can't be held liable in a court of law, okay? Which means you can't be found guilty if you can prove that you're using self-defence. So before I go on, what I'd like to do is talk about self-defence, as in what is self-defence? Okay, or when can you class yourself as defending yourself or another person? So probably the best way of describing that is through a scenario. Let's say somebody's challenges you to a fight, and you decide, okay, bring it on. Okay. Now as soon as you challenge the other person, well, when they challenge you and then you say, yeah, come on, let's do it then, you're not trying to minimise that problem. You haven't tried to walk away. You haven't tried to talk the person down, and discuss it, communicate, whatever. Okay, you haven't done anything to try and prevent that problem. So if they challenge you and then you go in and have a fight with them, you can't plead self-defence in a court of law, okay? Because it's not self-defence. You're actually just having a fight. You've just agreed to have a fight, and you're having a fight, okay? Now, if a person comes up to you and challenges you to a fight, and you ignore them and walk away, or you just ignore them and as best you possibly can, and you don't challenge them, or you don't try and aggravate the situation in any way, and they start to attack you, and then you defend yourself, then that's self-defense. Okay? So what happens in the real world is a lot of people, they'll antagonize a situation, or they'll create a situation, create an argument, create a disturbance, and then when a person attacks them, and they fight back, they class that as self-defense. They try and say, oh, I was just defending myself. If you antagonize a situation, if you create an issue, if you are a part of creating that problem, then it's not self-defense if somebody attacks you, okay? Because you've actually created that problem. You've actually antagonized it. It's only self-defense if you didn't do anything to try and promote that problem from escalating into a fight, okay? So in a court of law, you could be found guilty if you antagonised the situation or amped it up or did whatever to create that issue, okay? So we need to be really clear exactly what self-defence is, because a lot of people don't really understand the word itself. They think that self-defence is simply if somebody attacks you, you can attack them back, okay? And that's it's not as simple as that, okay? It's just not as simple as that. So you must be very clear in understanding what is self-defense. Basically, respect others. Others should respect you. Don't go out causing trouble. Don't try and create problems, okay? Just mind your own business. Do what you've got to do. And if somebody else comes up and causes you issues, okay, don't antagonise it. Don't create more of an issue. And of course, if they have a go at you, then you can defend yourself, okay? So that's what self-defense is. So, and if you do defend yourself, as in Section 48 of the Crimes Act, okay, if you do defend yourself in that situation where somebody's attacked you and you're just defending yourself, then you can't be found guilty in a court of law, or you shouldn't be found guilty in a court of law because you are defending yourself. So, and you're justified in defending yourself, all right? And so all of that evidence, if it goes to court, all of that evidence will come out, and you need to prove your fact, okay, from witnesses, cameras, security cameras, your statement, the other person's statement, depending if they're telling the truth, whatever. But all the evidence should come forward, and it should all come to light that you were defending yourself. All right. Okay, so the next part of the Crimes Act is self-defence and the defence of another. Okay, so you can defend yourself under the law, and you can also defend another person. So if you think that somebody else needs to be defended, it may be a child, it may be a female on the side of the road being attacked by her partner, it could be another guy that you're out night clubbing or something like that, and you see some other guy being attacked, and you think, okay, that guy can't handle himself, he's not doing very well, I'm going to go in and do something to stop this, okay, and defend them. All right, so you can defend any other person that you believe needs defending because they can't defend themselves, or you just believe that you have the right to defend them because they haven't antagonised the situation, somebody's trying to attack them, so you can defend them even if they can defend themselves. You have the right to defend another person, okay, as well as yourself. Everyone is justified in using force in the defence of himself, so himself or herself, or another person, okay? Such force as in the circumstances as he believes them to be. It is reasonable to use, okay? So what that means is that you can use the force necessary to defend yourself or another person, and you can use whatever force you need to use or you believe you need to use at that moment in time if it is reasonable to use it. So what that's trying to say is that if you believe it's reasonable to use a certain amount of force based on that scenario or that situation, then you can use that amount of force. But just be aware that you may need to justify that amount of force that you used in a court of law. Okay? And so that's very important to understand. You can use whatever force you think is justifiable at that moment in time for that situation, but you must be able to justify that amount of force in a court of law. All right? And if you're found that you used what we call excessive force or too much force, okay, then you could be charged for that. Okay, so you could find yourself in big trouble and guilty of assault or something like that. So it must be just a justifiable amount of force. So you must be able to justify the amount of force that you're using. Okay. Now, let's just cover a little bit on that. So how do we know how much force to use in a situation? Well, I always focus on the use of minimum force, what we call minimum force, or the lowest amount of force necessary. Okay, so we only want to use the smallest amount of force or the lowest amount of force necessary to get the job done. So if somebody's doing something to you or to another person, you should always try to use the least amount of force to stop them from continuing their attack. Okay. Now that amount of force could be a wrist lock. It could be just a simple takedown without injuring them in any way. It could be you may need, if they're throwing punches, you may need to throw punches as well, or kicks or whatever. So the amount of force will be dependent. The amount of force that you use may be dependent on the amount of force that they're using. Okay, so this will come out more in later sessions when we're doing the practical self-defense techniques, and I'll bring up scenarios where you can actually physically see and understand more this in more detail. Okay, Section 48, another part of Section 48. Okay. So Section 48 does not provide immunity from prosecution. Okay, so that means that you have the right to defend yourself or another, but it doesn't mean that you're not going to get taken to court. Okay, if you plead self-defense. Okay, you can plead self-defense, but you could still be taken to court. But you could be found guilty if you've used excessive force, or the what you're calling self-defense wasn't actually self-defense, or it may have started off as self-defense, but you've used too much force and you've actually gone from being the victim to becoming the attacker. Okay, and so you've got to be very clear again with understanding what the words self-defense mean. So some people, and I'm just going to reiterate that, some people start off as the victim and have the right to defend themselves or another person. And when they defend themselves, they start to get the better of the other person, and then they start to use excessive force or continue the attack on that other person when they should stop or must stop. They don't stop, or they use more force than what is needed, and now that person that was the defender or the victim has now become the attacker. So the roles have switched, and so now initially you were at the legal right to defend yourself or another person, but then all of a sudden you become the attacker, and now you could be charged with assault. Okay, and depending on how far you take it, serious assault or even manslaughter. Okay, so you've got to be really careful and only use the force necessary to achieve your goal, and then stop there. Okay, and we'll get more into that, because you don't want to just stop, for example, and then the other person continues the attack. So we want to stop them from attacking us or somebody else, or even hurting themselves even. Okay, we can defend that person from themselves as well. Okay, so let's just be clear on that, because that person is another. All right, so we can defend them from themselves as well. Okay, so we only want to use the force necessary, but we can also stop them and then prevent them from continuing their attack without hurting them. Okay, any further. All right, so we need to be clear on that. Okay, it does. Section 48, which is the Self-Defence Act, does not provide immunity from prosecution. Okay, so you can still end up in court for using self-defence, unless the circumstances clearly show that the force used was appropriate and in self-defence. Okay, which I've already covered. The appropriate amount of force, you're only using the appropriate amount of force or the justified amount of force, and it was in the act of self-defence. And I've covered what is self-defence. Okay. The person who has used the force may have to explain their justification to a criminal court. Okay. So as I've already clearly stated, if you're going to use force against another person, you may end up in court and have to justify the force that you've used. So it's in your best intention to use minimum force and try not to harm the other person if you can. But if you do have to hurt them, as long as that force is justified and you're only using the amount of force that was needed to protect yourself or another, okay, or that person, all right? So only use the force that you need to use and no more than that, all right? Okay, let's move on. There are also circumstances in which a person and anyone acting lawfully to assist the person and under his authority is justified in using reasonable force to protect his property. So, basically you can use force to defend your property as well, if you need to. And you can also use force, I'll go over that again. There are also circumstances in which a person and anyone acting lawfully to assist the person and under his authority is justified in using reasonable force to protect his property. Okay, so what that's talking about is mainly defence force or security, where you are even corrections officers, where you're protecting somebody else's property. Okay, so for example, a security officer has the right to work on somebody else's property, and they are able to protect that property. Okay, from burglars, from shoplifters, or from somebody coming along and taking property, trying to steal property and things like that, or damage that person's property. So if you're lawfully working for somebody, and when I say lawfully, when you're doing that, you must have what we call a certificate of approval, or otherwise known as a COA, as a security officer. If it's your property or you live at a property, then you also have the right to defend and protect the property at that address. Okay, so you're what we would call acting lawfully to protect that property. Okay, so you can defend that property. All right. Some people think that, and we'll get into this more later on in scenarios, some people think that they can come along and take or shoplift from somebody else's property, and that you can't physically stop them. Well, highly wrong. The person or the security officer or the employee has every right to physically stop that person from stealing somebody else's property, okay, or property that you are lawfully allowed to protect. Okay, so you can physically stop that person, and you can use force if necessary to do that. The amount of force must be justifiable. Okay, and we'll cover that in more detail in a later series. Okay, we'll try and get through this last paragraph and we'll finish up there. Okay, this includes resisting having something taken by a trespasser, as I've just mentioned, defending his dwelling house from someone breaking in, as I just mentioned about a burglar, and preventing trespassing and the removing of trespassers. Okay, so this is the same if somebody is trespassing. If you're removing, if somebody is trying to trespass on your property, you have the right to use physical force to stop them from entering your property. Okay, and also if you're removing trespassers from your property, you have the right to physically remove them. And I'm going to cover all of this as well throughout the self-defense, where it's all based on realism. Okay, but does not permit a person to strike or do bodily harm to the trespasser in the process. So Section 48 of the Crimes Act 1961 allows you to remove a trespasser and use force to do that. However, you're not allowed to strike or use bodily harm to the trespasser or the person trying to trespass. There is another, basically the Section 48, when you're trespassing, you're not allowed to hurt somebody when you're trespassing them, but if they use force against you, okay, then you can use self-defense against them, where you can use force. So the force that you use against them must be justifiable. But initially, when you're trespassing somebody or preventing a trespasser, you're not allowed to hurt them. You can't go out of your way to hurt the person. If you hurt them, you're breaking the law. If you go to remove them physically without hurting them, that's fine. And if they try to fight you and you defend yourself, then obviously if they're striking at you, you can strike at them. So then you are allowed to strike, okay? And if you hurt them, then we're on a completely different subject, okay? So you're actually trespassing the person as well as defending yourself. So in that light, you can hurt them, but only what is justifiable, okay? You must still justify the amount of force you're using. So I just wanted to cover those parts of the law, and I know it's quite in depth and spread out at the moment, but I will close it in so it becomes more clear as we start doing the self-defense and scenarios. Okay. Anyway, what we'll do is we'll finish up there with this lesson because it's gone for about 20 minutes or so, and we'll come back into part 3, and we'll talk about defense against assault and basically what is assault. Okay. So thank you for coming along. Subscribe, like, comment, and I'll see you on part 3. Thanks for coming along.